Bronwen and Matthew, who are going to be the kind of experts on this panel. But I can add a little bit more introduction, about myself on this kind of topic. So I'm currently trying to write a paper right now. So I think this session will be equally as useful for me. I have started doing peer review. I only really started getting opportunities for peer review when I started my research fellowship, which is just our fancy terminology that we use for a postdoc here at Massachusetts General Hospital. And yeah, so I have like a little bit of experience. I've got a few publications, but definitely not as many as some of the other panelists that will be presenting today. So I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Matthew Lloyd and Dr. Bronwen Martin, who I'm sure can do a fantastic introduction of themselves that I do not have. So maybe we can start with you, Matthew.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Matthew Lloyd. I work at the University of Bath, where I am a senior lecturer. That's the equivalent of a US associate professor. My background is chemistry and biochemistry, and I now work on fatty acids, enzymes using enzyme kinetics, chemical biology, and I'm interested in developing enzyme inhibitors as drugs, enzyme inhibitors as potential drugs.
Thank you, Matthew. So, Bronwen, would you like to go next?
Okay, well, thank you, James. It's great being here, and thank you also to Sam, Alice, and Hannah and the Hello Bio team for putting on a really fun conference. I think everyone's been looking forward to it. So I work at the University of Antwerp. I'm a neuro-endocrinologist by training, and I work in the Faculty of Pharmaceutical, Biomedical and Veterinary Sciences, and I help our researchers with writing their grants and with their papers, and I also do a lot of the research communication for my faculty.
So that was fantastic. Thanks both for the little introduction. So we have a few questions that were we've already generated some answers on, but we're totally up for Q&A. So please, any questions that you may have. I have questions about publishing. I'm sure many of you in the audience will have questions about publishing. It's the one thing that we're told to do as academics. Whether it is the best means of getting our work out there is a different debate. But I think we can really focus on, the first question here. So what are your top 3 tips for writing great scientific papers? So maybe we can do, Matthew do one, Bronwen do one, and we can kind of just go like that.
Okay, yeah, top 3 tips. Think about who you want your audience to be, because that's going to determine which journal or other media you're going to publish in. Think about how you want your audience to use your publication, because clearly if you're writing a review, that's going to be used in a different way from an experimental paper, for example. And then finally, write a complete and compelling story. So those are my tips.
Yeah, you've hit every nail on there. So Bronwen, would you like to go next?
So yeah, those are excellent tips, and I fully agree with Matthew on that. I think writing a compelling story, so having a very good structure to your paper, is very important. There's nothing worse than sort of having to read through a very muddled, confusing paper where the data isn't really sort of explained in a coherent manner. So how do you go about sort of creating good structure to your paper? The best way to do that is to really think about your data and how you're going to present your data, and to first get your data packaged into a coherent story. And then once you have your data packaged into a coherent story, then you can start the writing process. The second tip that I would add to that is, it's something that is often overlooked by people, is to think carefully about your title and your abstract. So search engines are used to access your paper. So most people will search for your paper on PubMed or on Google. And the search engine algorithms will look for specific keywords. And if those specific keywords aren't in your title or in your abstract, then your paper won't be found. And there's approximately, 34 million publications in PubMed at the moment. So it's important that you write your paper and that it will also be found by people so that they'll read it. So really be careful to think well about which keywords you add into your title and which keywords you add into your abstract. And then the third tip that I would add is in the discussion, really sort of try to have a nice summary where you sort of summarize the data and also try and offer an explanation for the data, or if there is no explanation, sort of try and sort of come up with alternative answers. So structure, think about the keywords in the title and in the abstract, and in the discussion have a nice summary and basically a take-home message for people reading your paper.
So I think they're really all really good points, and I'm just going to add a few things, mainly focused towards early career researchers, that I can think about that I've had to deal with over the last 5 years where I've been publishing. I think the first thing is I tell my students in the lab, get a Google Scholar account, get a ResearchGate account, get ORCID, get everything you can where your publications are going to go, right? Because that is the amount of people that read my publications just on ResearchGate, for example. They don't even see it on you know, when they go on PubMed. So, and the other thing would be Twitter as well, LinkedIn. You know, people will click on your paper from those. I've seen people put publications on their email signature because they want to get every email they send, someone click on their paper, or even just linking to, you know, your Google Scholar or ResearchGate. And, you know, keeping track of these things, because I'm currently applying to positions right now, and the amount of things that people look at your publication. So having it all already formatted is extremely helpful, and, you know, being able to access that and, you know, provide it to people who are interested is really helpful. So I think we can move on to the next question and can kind of go from there. So there is question number 2 is where can you get papers published as an early career scientist, and what's the best way to go about it? So Matthew or Bronwen, whoever wants to take this one first can.
Perhaps Bronwen, you'd like to start on this one?
Okay, so at the moment there are lots of different journals, so I think we're all sort of spoilt for choice, so that's nice. But it can also be overwhelming, because where do you start? So I think the first thing to do is, if you're an early career researcher, is to first talk to the people in your lab and to your PI and ask them, which journals do you typically publish this type of data in? Are there journals with which you've had good experiences, journals with which you've had bad experiences, where, for example, it took forever to peer review your paper, or the reviewer comments weren't particularly helpful? So first get feedback and advice from people around you in the lab, because they might already be able to offer you that advice. The second thing is to sort of find a good balance between the cost of the journal. Some journals are extremely expensive, which for early career researchers might not always be a good option. So ideally, you want to find a good balance between the cost, a high impact factor, and ideally also an open access journal, because I think publishing your data open access really helps with the visibility of your paper, because a lot more people will be able to access it. Another useful thing, I used to work at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda in Maryland in the US, is often on our Bethesda main campus, we would have visitations or lectures from editors from journals. So people on the editorial team would come to our campus and they would talk about the journal, they would talk about the review process, they would talk about the type of work that the journal was interested in. Go to these presentations, meet these editors, and start creating a network of people that you know, so that you know which would be good places where you can submit your work. And then the last tip that I would have is start creating a network early, because journals will always ask you, do you have a recommended reviewer? So if you can start making a network of people that you know and trust, then these also are potential people that could be a recommended reviewer, or that would be able to suggest someone as a recommended reviewer. So those are my tips. So on to Matthew.
Thank you. Yeah, so great advice. I think the thing I'd just like to add there is, obviously you're going to be reading research in your specialist area, and so just think about whether any of these journals that are publishing this research from other labs might be suitable for the research that you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's some really helpful advice. So I think I might add 2 extra points. I know in my PhD we had a journal club, and that was a great idea, a great way of finding out which journals were good for the sort of work that we were doing, because you know, we were presenting work that's coming out in the field, and we were presenting that. And then I think the other thing would be obviously talking to your supervisor. I've heard of many horror stories where, you know, someone's been asked to publish a paper, the paper gets published and the supervisor doesn't know about it, or vice versa, right? So I think having a really good open line of communication with your supervisor is extremely important. You don't want to burn any bridges, especially with your supervising team. So just make sure everyone's on the same page. Everyone's happy with the journal that you're going to submit to, and also don't be afraid to aim high. I've submitted many what they called like a pre-submission inquiry, which a lot of these kind of high impact journals have. Many times I've been rejected. I think I've never actually got one into one of those high impact, the super high impact journals, the Natures, the Cells, everything. But you know, just the mere purpose of pulling together a very short 500-word summary of the article was extremely helpful in the kind of writing process, because it's definitely helpful to have a journal in mind before you start writing, because you can get the formatting established and, you know, make sure everyone's happy with that. So I think we can move on to the final question. I'm just going to reiterate to the people who are watching, if they have any questions, just add it into the comment section. So the final question, one I can also talk a little bit about, is how do you know when you're ready to start peer reviewing papers, and how do you get started? So maybe Matthew or Bronwen, whoever wants to take this first.
Yeah. Okay. So I think knowing when you're ready to start, you need to have built up a reasonable expertise in the techniques that you're using. So primarily when I review, I look at the way in which the experiments have been done. I'm not an expert in the absolute sort of specific subject area of the thing that I'm reviewing usually, but I will know about the techniques which have been used, and I can make a judgment about whether the experiments have been done correctly or not. And in terms of getting started, well, probably a good way of getting started is just to register as an author with various journals that you'd like to publish in, and make sure that you add the various sort of descriptions and keywords of what your expertise are, because I know one of the main ways in which journal editors find reviewers is they just look at their bank of authors.
And Bronwen, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so I think Matthew really sort of covered some important tips. I fully agree that you really have to make sure that you have enough expertise and knowledge of the actual experiments that were performed to be able to judge someone else's experiments. Because if you've never done those types of experiments, it's really difficult to really know if they've done the experiments appropriately. I started peer reviewing when I was a junior postdoc, and the way I did it was my PI was often invited to peer review papers. And then he would actually give the paper to me, and then I would do the peer review, and then I would give my peer review comments to him, and then he would go through it together with me, so I could see if there were things that I needed to do differently. For example, one thing that I find a lot of reviewers do is they're often too vague. They don't specifically state exactly what the author needs to do. You know, they'll say, oh, it would be nice to do this experiment, but do you actually mean that we have to do that experiment, and under which conditions? And you have to be very specific of what you ask the authors. So I think it helps if you can find a senior person in the lab. It doesn't need to be your PI, but maybe a more senior postdoctoral fellow, for example, and see if for the first peer reviews, whether you can do them together, and then you can learn from a more senior person. Another way that I learned to do peer reviews was we did special issues of journals. So we did a special issue around a topic. Then we would invite authors to write and submit papers for their special issues. And then we would find peer reviewers for the special issue, and then myself and my PI as the co-editor of the special issue, we would then oversee the full peer review process. And then you can actually see different people's peer review styles. So that's actually very, very helpful to learn from yourself. So yeah, those are my tips.
And I can just add a few extra things. So it's becoming quite a new thing. I think journals now realizing not everyone, especially senior academics, have way too much on their plate to do tons of peer review. So a lot of these, journals, I even saw Nature Communications, they've just started a career, it's basically an early career reviewer panel. So essentially, you work with an editor to review a paper, and if that goes well, they then bring you in to do more. So you kind of pick a paper that's within your expertise. I've currently done this for, I think it's Alzheimer's research and therapy. So it falls very much within my remit of my research. So I was able to actually get my first peer review because I signed up to their Reviewer Academy, I think is what it's called. And then, you kind of click what you're interested in. And then I've also done that the same way Matthew was describing earlier of, signing up as an author for journals. I didn't realize you can do that even if you're not submitting a paper. So you can just literally just sign up as a, person on that account. And then you can, basically establish your author profile. And then people will then reach out to you for review. And I've also had a few people put me down as potential reviewers. Not all of them always come through. Sometimes I'll get a message saying, oh, do you think you could review this? And I would say yes. And then I never actually get a message from the editor. So I think just, having a bit of a presence is definitely helpful. Occasionally people will message me on Twitter or LinkedIn or send me an email and just ask whether, as they're an editor in a journal, whether I could, potentially peer review. And I have rejected a lot where I've just not had the skill set. I know some were like a meta-analysis and I don't have that kind of statistical background. So I think, and there's definitely a line, sometimes you can also peer review. So for example, I recently did one about a big proteomics study, and I could review the kind of the techniques they used in the proteomics, but there was some aspects of the paper I couldn't really review. But because I was part of the early career reviewer academy, they said, that's fine, just peer review the bit that you're kind of an expertise on. And then you can specify the area that you weren't able to, completely peer review. So they had a statistician come in and look at this specific part of the paper because I wasn't an expert there. So I think, knowing your limitations, which Matthew was kind of describing before about the techniques, and that, Matthew would peer review the techniques, but maybe not have a full understanding of the kind of the whole goal of the paper. So I think they were two areas that I kind of approached just to start peer reviewing. And obviously with what Bronwen mentioned, I think they call it like ghost peer review now. I was always hesitant to do that because, especially to try and, for me trying to apply for a visa to stay in the US, for example, I have to show that I peer reviewed, and it gets difficult if you don't have the letters from the editor to say that you did it specifically. So I think there's a balance. If you want to do some just practicing, I think that's a great approach. But then if you want to get, your name down as a peer reviewer, I think, just starting to establish those relationships with your editor. And sometimes your supervisor can recommend you as the peer reviewer instead of it being them. So I think there's definitely a balance there. So we had a few questions from the audience, and the first one is from Joanne to talk a little bit more about preprints and open publishing. It seems like the wave of the future. So maybe Bronwen first, because correct me if I'm wrong, where you are, isn't everything has to be published in open access journals? I know some European countries, not the UK, are being very specific about everything has to be open access, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
So it depends on who your funding agency is. So if you get European funding, then indeed it needs to be made open access. And also in Belgium, a recent copyright law has been passed that for the biomedical sciences, within 6 months, you need to make a version of your paper freely accessible, open access. So indeed, in Europe, we're sort of making big strides to make work more freely available for everyone. I think the preprint servers are very exciting, and I think they really sort of started to be used a lot during the corona pandemic. I think we saw a huge influx of thousands of papers being added to the preprint servers. And I think that was really sort of the turning point, in my opinion, for these preprint servers, where they really became more mainstream, that it became more of a common thing to put your paper first on a preprint server, like, for example, bioRxiv in the biomedical sciences. And there are actually more and more journals now that require you to first deposit your paper in a preprint server before you can submit the manuscript to them. I'm all for them. I think that they're a great step towards the future. I think it's also good because They'll help to have more of an open peer review process, which I also think is a significant step forward. So I would say, if you can, there's nothing wrong with depositing your papers in a preprint server. I think it's an excellent way forward.
And Matthew, do you have any comments to add on that?
Yeah, so largely when we do open access publishing, the university at which I work, we have kind of transformative agreements with various journals. So what that means is that when we subscribe, the university subscribes to the journal, then we can publish open access our own papers. And so because the journals which we're doing this for are very good journals for the type of research I want to publish, then I often will go for those journals anyway. So that's good. I have very limited experience of using preprint servers. I think generally speaking that's very good. The one note of caution that I really want to add is just if you have a journal in mind that you're going to eventually publish your paper, just check the author guidelines to see what they say about pre-publication.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that. I think we recently published, and that journal had its own preprint server, if that makes sense. So it was very much like, you know, we submitted to the journal, they published it open before we finished all of the review. So it was kind of like a halfway point, really. Whereas I don't think they would have permitted us to put it on, for example, bioRxiv, because they had their own system in place for, you know, having their own preprint server. So I think definitely it's beneficial. And I know a lot of funders, and, you know, I don't know specific. I know in the US and somewhat of what's happening in the UK, but there's definitely more of a push to say, okay, preprint is not the same as a publication, but it's very much on the way to being a publication, right? So a lot of funders would say, okay, you've got a preprint, that kind of ticks that box of having that publication. Maybe it's not a full, you know, publication, but still it's showing that you're able to pull your work together in a format that can be accessible and can be reviewed by others in the field. And I think what the point Bronwen made about COVID is it's kind of fascinating how much press preprints got. I think that was both a positive and a negative. You would see good preprints and you'd see bad preprints, and there was no real system in place to kind of vet those too early on. But I know, for example, medRxiv, which is the kind of more medical focused version of bioRxiv, they definitely introduce a few more steps that you have to kind of go through in order to get those things published. So we have another question. I think it was from Sam. And it says probably a topic for a whole other talk. But anyway, but what are your next steps if you get a paper rejected? So I don't know if Matthew or Bronwen's had a recent paper rejection, but that would be a great place to start. Okay,
I'll start with this one. So yeah, I think we've all had papers rejected. I think it's quite a normal process. It depends a little bit for what reason it was rejected. Sometimes it's rejected, but if you contact the editor says yes, but with the necessary changes and this and that, we would still be interested in your paper. So sometimes it's worth contacting the editor and saying, look, we are very interested in publishing in this journal. If we make modifications, would you still consider it? If the editor says yes, then it's worth going on a process with that journal. If the editor says no, we're totally not interested, then of course you consider other steps. And like I said before, there are so many journals out there, then it's just a matter of finding another appropriate journal for your work. Sometimes what has happened in my case, for example, is we had one reviewer who was being very difficult and who was he wanted the paper rejected. We had written a review article, and the reviewer said, you need to reject this article because all they did was they reviewed other people's literature and they didn't put any of their own data in. And we were kind of, well, that's the whole purpose of a review article. And in that case, we did have a lengthy discussion with the editor-in-chief of the journal, where we said, look, we would like to bring on additional reviewers because clearly this reviewer might not be the most appropriate person. And then an additional reviewer was brought on, and then our paper was actually accepted with minor modifications. So sometimes it helps to really sort of contact the editor and go in conversation with the editor and see, you know, can we sort of get our paper into this journal? Or if the editor makes it very clear, no, it's not within our scope, we're totally not interested, then just cut your losses and find another journal.
Matthew, any additional comments on that?
Yeah, so I've had this happen quite a few occasions. So generally speaking, if I get a paper rejected, or even if it comes back with major revisions, then I will contact the editor and ask for further clarification. It really depends on the circumstances. So, for example, about 10 years ago, I had a paper where the reviewer clearly hadn't read the paper properly. And they said, you need to do experiments X, Y, and Z. And we'd already done the experiments. And I wrote back to the editor and I said, look, you've rejected the paper based on the reviewer. The reviewer has clearly not read the paper properly because we've already done it. The editor then allowed us to resubmit the paper, but we then got another reviewer who didn't understand the paper. And at this point, we kind of thought, well, really, if the reviewers are not understanding it, we're probably sending it to the wrong journal. And so we submitted and published with a different journal instead. On the other hand, so I had a review article relatively recently, so this was in 2020, where I got okay reviews from the reviewers, but the editor expressed some concerns, and I had an extended conversation which was very helpful with the editor, and we eventually ended up rewriting the paper, and it was published nearly a year after the original submission. So the editor was extremely helpful in this particular case.
So I think I'll just add a few final points there. So I think what both Bronwen and Matthew said was incredibly important, and the points I took home from that was, you know, don't be afraid to contact the editor, whether it comes from, you know, the first author or the last author. I don't know how much difference it would make, but generally probably makes sense to come from the last author because they're slightly more senior. Especially, you know, focused towards early career researchers. And I think the point that I also took home from that from Bronwen and Matthew is that rejection is normal. It's extremely normal in academia. You kind of become hopefully slightly immune to it as time goes on, but it's just a normal part of what we do. It's extremely competitive, and there is way more publications that can be potentially submitted. So don't be afraid, to start high and kind of expect rejection. And if you get in, great. If you don't, kind of set your goals a little bit lower, and then really focus on just getting that great story out there, getting that publication out there, and hopefully not having to deal with rejection, even if it does mean having to either negotiate a little bit with the editor or think about where you're going to resubmit to, or even if it means doing review. I don't think I've heard any single early career researcher I've ever met saying they got a publication in one go. I've never I've ever met anyone who's had that happen. So I don't know if Matthew or Bronwen has, but yeah, very, very rarely have I ever heard of that. I don't think I can even think of an example. So I think it's just very normal to expect there to be some kind of discussion about the publication from the reviewers, and all of these things are going to need a little bit of work, and these things take time, but you'll definitely get there. So firstly, I'd like to thank everyone in the audience. I can't see your faces, but I assume you're lovely people, and I really appreciate you watching this, and obviously really appreciate both Bronwen and Matthew for kind of getting involved in this panel and providing your expert input, and obviously to Sam, to Alice, and all the countless people behind the scenes at Hello Bio. Hello Bio have been very supportive of me in my career, so I really appreciate that. And thank you for Hello Bio to putting on this event. So I think Alice is back now. So Alice, take it away.
Thank you so much, James, Bronwen and Matthew. That was absolutely fantastic.